Hello, beta. Good evening, everyone. Beta, today I want to go ahead and I want to discuss the ISPC and MR model in detail. Now, this is a very, very important model. And not only is it important from the point of view of exam, but it is a very important model if you want to go into policy making. तो अगर कभी भी फ्यूचर में कोई भी आरबीआई में जॉब करना चाहता है या किसी बैंक में जॉब करना चाहता है या किसी गवर्नमेंट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में जॉब करना चाहता है, for that purpose the ISPC-MR model is very important model to understand. It's an extremely important model. But try to understand this thing. In this model, we have three equations. It's also called as three equation model. Isko three equation model bhi bola jata hai. It has three equations in it. One is the IS equation, जो हमारा goods market equation है, जो हमने ISLM में भी पढ़ा था. So one of the equation we have is called as the IS equation. But the second equation that we have, that's the PC equation. माने that's the Phillips curve equation. And the third equation that we have, that's called as the MR equation, माने the monetary rule equation. So in this three equation model, the three equations that we have, that is IS, PC and MR. One of you may ask कि ma'am, what about the LM equation? Where has that gone? वो कौन सा कहाँ चले गई वो equation? Money market equation. Usually तो we used to study the ISLM model. So don't worry, I will be answering all of those questions where the LM model went, where that money market will be dealt. उस सब के बारे में भी हम बात करेंगे धीरे धीरे. But अभी के लिए हम इन equations को एक बारी list down कर देते हैं and we try to analyze what these equations are all about. So first of all, you need to understand the IS equation, right, beta? So if you remember, how were we writing the IS equation? We were writing IS equation as Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. Beta, whenever we write the IS equation, you need to remember that there is a role of interest rate. हमने हमेशा से बात की है कि investment is a function of interest rate. But the question is nominal interest rate or real interest rate. So you need to remember that usually speaking, whenever we write any IS equation model, we always assume that investment is a function of real interest rate. Why real interest rate, bache? Because we are talking about goods market. And goods kya hai? Goods, basically, we are quantifying them. Goods, real income kya hota hai? What is your real income? When you ask how many goods you can afford, तो real is always in terms of goods. और अगर हम goods market की ही बात कर रहे हैं, तो shouldn't that be in terms of real interest rate, right? So you need to understand that the investment is actually a function of real interest rate. ठीक है? And if you remember, हमने ऐसा कुछ लिखा था that I is equal to I bar minus B I, but यहाँ पे I real interest rate होता है. Investment is always a function of real interest rate. Okay. Now, beta, I can go ahead and make this like this. C is equal to C bar plus CY plus I bar minus BR plus G bar plus NX. So we can go ahead and we can bring all these autonomous factors together. हम सारे के सारे autonomous factors को एक साथ लेके आ सकते हैं. We can bring these autonomous factors together. This factor right here, this factor right here, this factor right here, and this factor right here. These are all autonomous in nature. So what we have rather gone ahead and done now, we have written a simple way of the IS equation. हमने उन सारे autonomous factors को A consider कर लिया है. And rather than considering this as B, the book has gone ahead and considered this as alpha. And this is your real interest rate. तो हमने अपना IS equation को कुछ ऐसे लिख दिया that the IS equation has just two components to it. One is your income or the output, and the second is your interest rate. And we are going ahead, beta, and we are saying that y is equal to a minus alpha r. हमने इसको थोड़ा सिंप्लीफाई करके IS इक्वेशन को ऐसे लिखा है. Now just try to understand this a bit more. थोड़ा और deep dive करते हैं. So we have introduced, if you remember, when we were doing in the last classes, weight setting and price setting model, जब भी हम ये weight setting, price setting model पढ़ते थे, we used to go ahead and say that wherever our wage setting relation, it equates the price setting relation, what we go ahead and get, that is known as natural rate of unemployment. Natural rate of unemployment. And this natural rate of unemployment, beta, it was also called as at the level of full employment level. तो जो हमारा natural rate of unemployment था वो full employment level के corresponding था. Now here we are introducing that itself. So we are saying that, let us say when output is at full employment level, जब output full employment level पे होगा, that means everybody in the economy is employed, सबके पास jobs हैं, except seasonal and frictional unemployment, everybody in the economy is employed. Then beta, at that point, I am calling that level of output as my equilibrium level of output. So I am saying that usually we will write our IS equation as y is equal to a minus alpha r. ये हमारा usual IS equation है कि y is equal to a minus alpha r. But जब हमारा output equilibrium level of output पे होगा, when our output will be at full employment level of output, it would be at equilibrium level of output, then at that point, we will go ahead and we will say YE. And at that point, at that level of output, the interest rate that will exist in the economy, it will be called as RS. So when Y is equal to YE, जब Y natural level पे होगा, so let me give you an example. So suppose I am telling you that beta, my IS equation is y is equal to 100 minus alpha value is 1 times r. And now I am telling you that beta, my full employment level of output is 90. Find r. So what will you do? You will put 90 here. So 90 is equal to 100 minus r. So r will be 100 minus 90, that means 10. So that interest rate, when output is at full employment level, that interest rate bache, that is known as the stabilizing interest rate. That interest rate is called as stabilizing interest rate. So come back and see here. So I am saying YE is equal to A minus RS. So when I plug Y as YE, I will have R as RS. Now what we can go ahead and do, we can take these two equations together. So usual IS equation kya hai? Y is equal to A bar minus alpha R. And when Y is equal to YE, R is equal to RS, so YE will be A bar minus alpha RS. And I will subtract 1 from. I will just subtract 1 from 2. So what will I get? Y minus YE is equal to A bar minus A bar minus alpha R minus alpha R. Yes. I have subtracted one equation from the second. So what will I get? Y minus YE is equal to minus alpha R plus alpha RS. Better take minus alpha common, R minus RS. y minus ye. Clear बच्चे? तो this has become your equation. अब थोड़ा सा इसकी इंटरप्रिटेशन जरूरी है. Let us try to interpret this equation. क्या बोल रहा है ये बच्चे? See, this is telling me the output gap. ये मुझे बता रहा है एक तरीके से कि हाउ मच आउटपुट डिविएट्स फ्रॉम द फुल एम्प्लॉयमेंट लेवल ऑफ आउटपुट. हमारा जो इक्विलिब्रियम लेवल ऑफ आउटपुट है उसके कंपैरिजन में करंट आउटपुट क्या है. इट कैन बी, दिस गैप कैन बी पॉजिटिव ऑल्सो, दिस गैप कैन बी नेगेटिव ऑल्सो. It means my actual level of output in the economy can be more than YE also, and it can be less than YE also. And then I am saying that there is an inverse relationship between this and the interest rate gap. ये मुझे बता रहा है the gap between actual interest rate and stabilizing interest rate. Gap between actual interest rate and stabilizing interest rate. And I see that there is a negative sign here. So there is an inverse relationship between the two. दोनों के ही बीच में एक inverse relationship exist करता है, right? Let us take an example to understand this thing. So what I can go ahead and I can do is, I can take that, let my interest rate actually be 10%. और वो इंटरेस्ट रेट जो फुल एम्प्लॉयमेंट लेवल ऑफ आउटपुट के लिए चाहिए वो इंटरेस्ट रेट है 8%. सो करेंटली इन माय इकोनॉमी द इंटरेस्ट रेट इज 10% and the stabilizing interest rate. But what was stabilizing interest rate? That interest rate which you require for output to be at full employment level. अगर मुझे अपना आउटपुट फुल एम्प्लॉयमेंट लेवल पे चाहिए तो उस टाइम पे मेरा इंटरेस्ट रेट 8% इकोनॉमी में होना चाहिए. इट शुड बी एट 8%. I am taking for simplicity alpha to be 1. So what will I go ahead and get, bache? I will get y minus ye. See this? Y minus ye is equal to minus, beta, instead of alpha, I will plug 1. And then I will get, beta, r minus rs. So r is 10 minus rs is 8%. 8%. So y minus ye will be minus 0.02. That means negative. And beta, when is the gap between two things negative? कब gap negative होता है? Gap is negative when you do small minus big. अगर 5 minus 10 करोगे तब negative gap आएगा ना? 10 minus 5 तो positive gap देगा. So if your gap is negative, it means that y is less than ye. ऐसा हो सकता है कि शायद जो y है वो कम रहा हो, ye ज्यादा रहा हो. So if I don't take it in these terms and I just take generally beta to make this explanation easier, तो ऐसा कुछ हो सकता है that maybe your actual level of output would have been say 12 and your full equilibrium level of output may have been 14. क्योंकि जब मैं 12 minus 14 करूंगी then I will get the answer as -2. So try to interpret what we have learned. क्या देखा हमने? We are seeing that when I have R more than RS, जब मेरा interest rate stabilizing interest rate के ऊपर था, then we go ahead and we notice that your actual output is less than full equilibrium level of output. This is what we have gone ahead and interpreted. Isn't it? तो ये हमारा ये इक्वेशन बता रहा है that the output gap is inversely related to the interest rate gap. Output gap is inversely related to the interest rate gap. Clear? Okay. Now try to understand, थोड़ा सा और आगे समझो अब. See, every central bank, whenever we talk about any central bank has some level of inflation as its target. हर सेंट्रल बैंक की ना कुछ इन्फ्लेशन होती है जो उसका टारगेट इन्फ्लेशन होती है. ठीक है. नाउ बेटा we know, थोड़ा सा interpret करो, we know that there is inverse relationship between unemployment rate and inflation through the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve tells us that there is inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment rate. So we know कि जब जब unemployment rate बढ़ेगी, inflation economy में घटेगी. Clear? But when will unemployment rate increase? Whenever employment rate will fall, unemployment rate will increase. अगर कम लोग employed होंगे तो ज्यादा लोग unemployed होंगे. If less will be employed, more will be unemployed. And when unemployment rate will be high, then we know that inflation will fall. Right? But when will employment will be less? When output will be less. अगर production ही कम है, then people employed will also be less. Am I understood? Okay. Now, when your output will fall, we know there is inverse relationship between output and interest rate. माने interest rate economy में high चल रहा होगा. So we are trying to just link things out that somehow we are able to link the interest rate also to inflation. We are able to bring some relationship between interest rate and inflation, and this will be very useful. जैसे जैसे हम इस मॉडल को डेवलप करते जाएंगे, ये चीज बहुत यूजफुल होगी कि इंटरेस्ट रेट और इन्फ्लेशन रिलेटेड कैसे हैं, हाउ आर द टू रिलेटेड विद ईच अदर. ओके, ठीक है बेटा. नाउ ट्राई टू अंडरस्टैंड दैट इफ आई हैव अ पर्टिकुलर आउटपुट लेवल इन माइंड. मतलब अगर मैं सोच लूं कि देखो मुझे ना आउटपुट, I'm just coming back to this equation. So y minus ye is equal to minus alpha r minus rs. But each economy knows कि what is its full employment level of output and full employment level of corresponding interest rate. हर इकोनॉमिस्ट को, हर सेंट्रल बैंक को ये पता होता है कि what will be the full employment level of output in that economy. ठीक है. So for example, the central bank knows that the full employment level of output in the economy is 100 and alpha in the economy is 1, and the central banks know that the corresponding interest rate is say 3%. ये central bank को information है. Now, suppose this year, there is a period of recession. बहुत बुरा हाल चल रहा है country का. Suppose in a particular country, it's a very horrible period. अब किसी तरीके से ना सेंट्रल बैंक को इस साल आउटपुट को इंक्रीज करना है. So the central bank aims that it will keep the output at 120. Right? Central bank ने एक aim बनाया कि this year I will want to increase the output and I will keep my output at 120. So if instead of y, I will put my target level of output. मैंने अपना target output यहाँ पे लिख दिया that my target output is 120. But what will be the corresponding interest rate? I can go ahead and find it out. So I will get 20 is equal to minus 1, r minus 3. So minus 20 is equal to r minus 3. So I will be able to get some value of r. मैं आपको corresponding r दे सकती हूँ. I can give you the value of the r. Clear? This is exactly what this statement is saying. That once you have an output goal in mind, आपको पता है कि आपको कौन सा output achieve करना है. You have a particular goal of output in mind, then correspondingly for that year, you can go ahead and choose that interest rate. आप उसके corresponding अपना एक interest rate choose कर सकते हो कि अच्छा ठीक है, this is my economy and this is how my equation for the economy is written. And I know that in this year, ये तो मुझे हमेशा ही पता है what is full employment level of output and what is stabilizing interest rate. Now for this year, it has been told to me कि क्या रखना है. So correspondingly, I can go ahead and I can choose the interest rate. Correspondingly, I can go ahead and choose the interest rate. Is that clear? This is what this equation is saying. So it takes interest rate changes to go ahead and feed through investment and thereby output. अब थोड़ा समझो वापस बेटा, suppose you want to increase the output. आपका aim है कि इस साल मुझे output को बढ़ाना है, right? Just try to think that when you will go ahead and lower the interest rate, we that investment is inverse function of the interest rate. So when my interest rate will lower, जब मेरा interest rate गिरेगा, automatically investment will increase. And when my investment will increase, automatically the level of output in the economy will increase. So what we are saying in this case is that the interest rate changes. जब भी आप कोई interest rate में change लेकर आते हो, the interest rate changes feed through investment. वो investment के रास्ते से जाकर output को change करती हैं, and it changes the level of the output. Right? So whenever you change the interest rate, it feeds through investment. It changes the level of investment, and investment is a component of Y. So when investment will change, then automatically the level of output in the economy will change. Automatically Y will change. This is our first equation, beta. In the ISLMPC model that we are talking about, this becomes our first equation that we have studied. Now let's go ahead and talk about the next equation, which is the Phillips curve equation. Okay. Now, when I talk about Phillips curve, तो बेटा आपको ये awareness होगी that in this current chapter, we have always talked about Phillips curve in inertia augmented space. हमने हमेशा Phillips curve को inertia augmented Phillips curve ही मान के सारा लेक्चर अभी तक का पढ़ा है, right? So what was inertia augmented Phillips curve? क्या बोल रहा था inertia augmented Phillips curve? The inertia augmented Phillips curve was saying that inflation this year will be inertia inflation plus alpha y minus y e plus alpha y minus y e. And then we had said कि देखो inflation में जितनी भी inertia है, inflation में जितने भी changes हैं, it is assumed that it only comes through the past inflation. It only comes through the lagged inflation. It only comes through the last year's inflation. So we had assumed that this inertia inflation is nothing but it is actually your last year's inflation. हमने ये assume किया था कि हमारी inertia inflation जो है, that is nothing but last year's inflation. In a way, I told you, you can take this to be like an adaptive expectation model. Right? In adaptive expectation, we are not learning from our mistakes completely. We are continuously making a mistake and we are assuming that the expected inflation, if you remember the expectation augmented Phillips curve, अगर मैं इसको expectation augmented Phillips curve से compare करूं, so that was pi t is equal to pi et plus alpha y minus ye. So we had gone ahead and we had taken it as some part of the expectation, right? It was getting affected by expectation. In inertia augmented Phillips curve, it is getting affected by inertia. है ना? But for simplicity, we just assumed that the inertia value of the inflation will simply be last year's inflation. वो simply पिछले साल का inflation हो जाएगा. And this is coming from my previous lectures that this will be your inertia augmented Phillips curve. राइट बेटा? अब मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट चीज पे आते हैं जिसपे मुझे फोकस करना है, एंड दिस इज कॉल्ड एज द मॉनेटरी रूल. इसको हम मॉनेटरी रूल बोलते हैं. व्हाट इज मॉनेटरी रूल? देखो ध्यान से समझना मेरी बात को, ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है. राइट बेटा, एवरी सेंट्रल बैंक हैज अ टारगेट इन्फ्लेशन. हर सेंट्रल बैंक का ना एक टारगेट इन्फ्लेशन होता है कि मुझे मेरा इन्फ्लेशन 2% पे रखना है या 3% पे रखना है या 10% पे रखना है. दे हैव अ टारगेट इन्फ्लेशन. In the economy, the inflation in reality, the actual inflation can be away from the target inflation. So, for example, if I tell you my target inflation is 2%, it is possible ना कि आपका जो actual inflation रहा होगा वो 1% भी हो सकता है और actual inflation जो रहा होगा that can be 3% also. So your actual inflation can deviate from the target inflation. आपकी actual inflation target inflation से अलग हो सकती है. Now, whenever there is a gap between actual and target inflation, you need to correct this. आपको इस चीज को correct करना जरूरी है क्योंकि आपको अपने target पे जाना है. Right? You need to make sure कि आप अपने टारगेट को अचीव करो, that you achieve your target inflation. Right? Whenever there will be a gap, between actual and your target inflation, but at that point, there will be a gap between your actual and potential output. Gap between your actual and potential output. तो हमारा टास्क क्या है, हमें क्या करना है मॉनेटरी रूल में. इन द मॉनेटरी रूल वी एम टू गो टुवर्ड्स द टारगेट इन्फ्लेशन. मेरा काम एक, इट्स अ सिंगल माइंडेड जॉब कि कुछ भी हो जाए मेरे को अपने इकोनॉमी को टारगेट इन्फ्लेशन पर ही रखना है. आई वॉन्ट टू इंश्योर दैट आई ऑलवेज अचीव दिस टारगेट इन्फ्लेशन. एंड आई विल डू एवरीथिंग पॉसिबल. मैं अपने आउटपुट को गिराऊंगी, आउटपुट को उठाऊंगी. आई विल डू एवरीथिंग पॉसिबल टू अचीव दिस टारगेट इन्फ्लेशन. इस टारगेट इन्फ्लेशन को अचीव करने के लिए आई विल गो अहेड एंड डू एवरीथिंग पॉसिबल. क्लियर? ओके. नाउ beta, we are saying that there is going to be an inverse relationship between the two. Mane, whenever your inflation, you want to bring the inflation down, you want to achieve your target inflation, whenever you want to lower your inflation, right, and you want to go towards your target inflation, then you must go ahead and you must change the level of the output. जब भी आप इन्फ्लेशन को टारगेट इन्फ्लेशन पे लेके जाना चाहते हो, कॉरेस्पॉन्डिंगली आप अपने लेवल ऑफ आउटपुट को भी चेंज करोगे. अब इसको हम अपने लास्ट क्लास की डायग्राम से एनालाइज करने की कोशिश करते हैं. लेट अस ट्राई टू एनालाइज. सो लेट मी जस्ट ड्रॉ दिस. एक एक स्टेप समझना. हाँ, देखो, this is your vertical Phillips curve. Beta, what was your vertical Phillips curve? Vertical Phillips curve is drawn at full employment level of output. So we are going ahead and drawing a vertical Phillips curve. Vertical Phillips curve always represents a long run situation. और जब भी हम long run situation की बात करते हैं, we will always be at full level employment, full level of output, full equilibrium level of output. So we can go ahead and say, give me a minute, that here y is equal to y. ठीक है. अब हमने अपना एक टारगेट इन्फ्लेशन सेट किया. So let's say that I tell you that my target inflation is 2%. Currently economy is at 2%. हम इस 2% का target inflation पर ही हैं. And at this point, beta, your actual inflation is 2%. Your inertia inflation is also at 2%. तो हमारा short run Phillips curve भी इसके through ही pass हो रहा है. This is my short run Phillips curve. And I am saying that my inertia inflation is also at 2%. Again, beta, you need to refer back to the last lecture. जिसमें हमने इस डायग्राम को एक बार अच्छे से समझाया है. वी हैव स्टडीड दिस डायग्राम इन डिटेल कि एट दिस पॉइंट वेयर योर शॉर्ट रन फिलिप्स कर्व एंड लॉन्ग रन फिलिप्स कर्व मीट, जिस भी पॉइंट पे ये दोनों इंटरसेक्ट करते हैं, at that point your actual inflation and your inertia inflation are equal to each other. आपका actual inflation और inertia inflation equal होते हैं. And you can understand this through this curve also, huh? So through this equation also, huh? So if I talk about long run, so we know that in long run y is equal to ye. अब अगर y ye के बराबर है, so I know y minus ye will be 0. So if y minus ye will be 0 and I will plug 0 here, so what will I get? Pi t is equal to, ये तो inertia inflation ही तो था, which I have plugged at pi t minus 1. So this will be equal to your inertia inflation. So your actual inflation and inertia inflation are equal when y is equal to ye. So currently I am at y equal to ye. मेरी economy point A पे है, where y is equal to ye, and my inertia inflation and actual inflation are equal to each other. They are equal to each other, right? Now, beta suppose due to some reason, हम उस reason की बाद में बात करेंगे, but say due to some reason there is increase in inflation in the economy, right? And let's say you reach some other point in the economy, say point B. तो क्या हुआ ना, that you have gone to this Phillips curve now. आप इस Phillips curve पे आ गए हो, right? And at this Phillips curve आपका जो inertia inflation है वो भी 6% है, और आपका जो actual inflation है वो भी 6% है. Your inertia and actual inflation are at 6%. Now you want to lower your inflation. आपका target inflation तो अभी भी 2% ही है. Somehow you want to lower this level of inflation. And as I have discussed with you, you can go ahead and you can take either a very aggressive policy, or you can go ahead and you can take a subtle policy. Aggressive policy क्या बोलेगी? Aggressive policy will go ahead and say कि from point B directly come to point C. हाँ, एकदम से अपना आप क्या करो कि B से C पे आ जाओ. And to come from point B to point C, what you will have to go ahead and do, बच्चे, you will have to lower the level of output. B से C पे आओगे जब आप इस inflation पे आओगे, when you want to, because you are on this Phillips curve now, तो आपका सारा action across this Phillips curve होगा, right? So when I am on this Phillips curve and I want to go ahead and I want to lower the level of my inflation, मुझे वापस target inflation पे आना है, so I need to come from B to C. But as I will come from B to C, it will be clear to you that I will have to lower the level of the output, right? But if I lower the level of the output, so how can I lower the level of output? So we know that in order to reduce output, we must increase the interest rate in the economy. Because when interest rate will increase, then this will go ahead and mean that investment will decrease. And when investment will decrease, then the level of the output will decrease. Isn't it? This is what will happen. तो बच्चे, अगर आप पॉइंट बी से सी देखो, दिस इज अ वेरी एग्रेसिव पॉलिसी, क्योंकि इमीडिएटली विद इन सेकेंड्स, विद इन ईयर, वी आर कमिंग फ्रॉम पॉइंट बी टू सी. हम एकदम से यहां पे आ गए एंड हमें आउटपुट बहुत ज्यादा लोअर करना पड़ा टू अचीव द टारगेट इन्फ्लेशन. Now the second thing that you can go ahead and you can do is you can go from a point B to a point like F. Now, when you go from a point B to a point like F, आपने अपने आउटपुट को थोड़ा सा कम किया. हाँ, so point B you had full employment level of output. You came to point Y1, आपने अपने आउटपुट को कम किया. And when you brought your output down, so the actual inflation in the economy also came down to 5%. Now, when the inflation in the economy came down to 5%, जब inflation 5% पे आ गई, so people started forming expectation according to 5%. उन्हें realize हुआ कि अरे 6% नहीं है inflation economy में. They will look at the lagged inflation value. They will look at last year's inflation value and they will realize that inflation is actually 5%. So when they will realize that the actual inflation is 5%, तो अगले साल वो expectation 5% के according form करेंगे and you will go to a new Phillips curve with the inertia inflation at 5%. So you will go to point like say D, right? Now you need to again lower the level of inflation in the economy because you need to attain your target inflation. So what will you go ahead and do, beta? You will again go ahead and you will choose a point like F dash. So again, you will deviate from your now at D, you are at your equilibrium level of output, but with higher inflation. So you will lower from your equilibrium level of output. आप वापस उससे deviate करोगे and you will be able to attain a lower level of inflation, say at point F dash, right? Then when you will attain this lower level of inflation, so people will again look at lagged inflation. They will reform their expectations. And when they will be reforming their expectations, so they will reach a point like E with a new Phillips. Right? Am I clear with it? Now, if I join all these points, F dash, A, if I join all these points, bache, what I will be getting is this inverse relationship, right? And this will be called as the monetary rule curve of the central bank. Now, if you remember, then in one of our class, we said that whether I will go to point F or point C depends on the risk aversion of the central bank. If not risk aversion, actually inflation aversion. अगर मेरे को इन्फ्लेशन से बहुत ज्यादा दिक्कत है, if I am too worried about inflation, तो मेरे फिलिप्स का मेरा जो इंडिफरेंस कर्व है, it will be closer to this. I want to attain lower inflation in less amount of time. But if I am not very inflation averse, मेरे को लग रहा है कि ठीक है इन्फ्लेशन बढ़ गई है, कम कर देंगे पर धीरे धीरे करेंगे. इफ आई एम नॉट वेरी इन्फ्लेशन एवर्स, मुझे बहुत ज्यादा फर्क इन्फ्लेशन से नहीं पड़ता है, then I will take a comparatively slower approach. So if I take a comparatively slower approach, then my ICs will be around this. So when I will be joining this tangency condition, मतलब मेरे ICs along this path भी हो सकते थे बच्चे. This could have been my monetary rule very well. But this is the monetary rule for that kind of central bank who is very inflation averse, जिसको बहुत जल्दी inflation को घटाना है. Different central banks will have different monetary rule. तो ये उस तरीके की central bank का monetary rule है जो बहुत ज्यादा inflation averse है, और ये उस तरीके के central bank का monetary rule है जो कम inflation averse है, जिसको थोड़ी थोड़ी इन्फ्लेशन घटानी है एक बारी में, who has to lower the inflation by less amount, who is not very inflation averse, who is less inflation averse. For such a central bank which is less inflation averse, they will go ahead along this monetary rule path. So what we learn from here, that different central banks, they can go ahead and they can have different monetary rules. Monetary rule path. But what kind of monetary rule paths they will be having, it would actually go ahead and depend on what kind of inflation aversion they have. If they're very high inflation averse, they don't want single amount of inflation, then they will be on the lower aspect of this Phillips curve, inertia augmented Phillips curve. Right? They will be here. They will try to lower inflation at one go. Right? So this kind of monetary rule will apply. But if they want to lower inflation by a lower amount, then this kind of monetary rule will apply. Am I clear? So the monetary rule will become steeper. And imagine one central bank who cannot take inflation at all away from the target. मतलब वो target से दूर देख ही नहीं सकता अपने आप को. It has to stick to the target. Then such kind of bank can also have horizontal monetary rule. It means it does not want to go ahead and deviate from the target at all. उसको target से deviate बिल्कुल ही नहीं होना है. Am I clear? So these are the three equations that we have: IS, Phillips curve, and monetary rule